Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being on our webinar today. My name is Melissa Milani, and I will be leading our webinar today talking about modeling and growing language with an AAC focus. Before we get going, I want to make sure that everyone has their materials. So if you have not done so already, please go ahead and click on the materials tab and you'll find everything in there that you can download. I also like to mention right up front that you'll notice in the materials tab that the PowerPoint is not there, and that is on purpose. That's because this is an ongoing webinar for ASHA CEUs, so we do not distribute the PowerPoint. So you're not missing anything. Usually people will ask about that. So I like to let you guys know up front that don't worry, you've got everything you need right there. So before we get started into our content, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. As I said, my name is Melissa Milani, and I am one of the consultants for Saltillo. I am located in Central Florida, and I serve the northeast part of the state, which includes basically from Sarasota across over to Melbourne, Satellite Beach area, and up into Jacksonville. It's kind of like a big triangle. So we are normally the Sunshine State, but we've been pretty rainy the last week. So if you're in that area, that triangle of Florida, then hopefully I have worked with you or will get to work with you in the near future. But if you are outside of that area, then please make sure you know where on our website to go and find your local consultant. So I am happy to be spending the next hour with all of you. So our presentation today is going to focus exclusively on our Saltillo products and our apps. So I'll mention NovaChat and TouchChat, and the low-tech board that I'm using is actually one of our low-tech boards that you can also find on our website. And we're going to be including topics of those products through this webinar. As I've already mentioned, I am a consultant with Saltillo, so I am financially compensated for my time spent working with them. And since I am a consultant, I do receive loaner devices to use during in-person trainings and demonstrations. And I am a licensed and certified speech language pathologist, member of ASHA and SIG 12. Please note that this course is also offered for ASHA CEUs, beginner professional area. Now, if you've never taken a GoToMeeting training, then let me take just a moment to orient you to something that should look similar to this that is on your side view of your monitor there. This is basically your dashboard, and everyone is muted. So if you have a question, what you can do is type it in the chat window. Me and Lisa, both of us will be monitoring this, and we will try and address any questions that pop up in the chat window there. If you have a question, you can obviously raise your hand, and again, there's the chat window there at the bottom. If you don't like this dashboard being up on your view, you can also collapse it if you need to. And this is where you can download the materials which I referenced so that we can make sure that you have everything that you need to. It looks like we had someone that was not able to hear, but it looks like some other people are saying that they can hear. So that's good. If you can't hear me, then please type in the chat to let us know, because we want to make sure that everyone's able to hear. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is for CEUs, but in order to get that, you do have to stay on the webinar the whole time. We will make sure that we keep it at an hour. So please make sure that you stay on the whole time. You do have an ASHA participation form so that you can submit that within 15 days. And again, you'll be able to find the instructions on there as well, but make sure you stay on the entire time. If you have a problem with your internet connection, if it kicks you off for some reason, just jump right back on as quick as you can. So one of the things that I like to do first is find out who's here. We have a nice group that is present with us. And so if you can go ahead and on your screen, you should see a poll here. If you can select the one item that you identify with the most for your reason for registering for this webinar, that would be fantastic. So you might be an SLP and also a parent of a child that uses AAC, but identify, for example, which one of those brought you to this webinar. It helps me. I will try and make some examples and comments geared towards who we have on here. And it looks like so far the vast majority are in the SLP or speech assistant world. We do have some parents, a couple teachers, and someone that identifies as other. So that could be like, for example, an OT or a PT, a caregiver, for example, that may not be an actual parent. So that's wonderful. So the vast majority is going to be our speech people. That's wonderful. Oh, yep, and I see in our comments we have a graduate student. That's fantastic, and a BCBA. That's great. Welcome. Thanks, everybody, for being here and spending an hour of your time as well. You may have noticed on the first slide that this is part 1 of a webinar series, and so next week we'll be doing part 2. So if you haven't already registered for that, go ahead and do that in the next couple of days so that you can get the second part of this series. If you have already taken that second part and you're here because you missed the first part at some point, then welcome. I'm glad to have you. So thank you, everybody, for participating in that. So here's what we're going to go through today. We're going to talk about communication as a whole, making sure that we're all coming into this with the same type of framework. I'm going to present some research because our SLPAs, our clinicians, for example, we're always using evidence-based practices. We're not just doing something because it looks fun or interesting. We always want to use something that has research to support it. And then we're going to go through the techniques, these 6 techniques that are proven through empirical evidence to support turn taking and increasing communication and novel utterances and all kinds of great things that we want our clients to be naturally starting to produce with their system. And because this is a webinar and I'm not actually with you in person, what I like to do is talk about it with the slides and then show you a video of these techniques in action as best as I possibly can, so that my goal for you as a learner is to be able to end this hour and have these 6 techniques already committed to memory. So you're going to hear them several times because, again, as a learner myself, when I go to a workshop or a conference, if I have to go back and look at my notes for something, the chances of me actually implementing the really cool stuff that I learned drops. I need to have that information committed to memory so that I can go out and start trying it and practicing what I just learned with my clients and my caseload. So hopefully that will help you so that you don't have to go back and reference your notes and say, oh, that was really great, but I have to, have these papers with me so that I can actually know what I'm doing. I am also going to ask you to connect what we're talking about with maybe clients that you work with, maybe kids on your caseload if you're in the school, or your own child. So just kind of think of something perhaps that you've done. It may not be something that you necessarily identified as evidence-based. It may just be something that you did because common sense told you that that sounded like it should work, or it may be something that you learned in grad school, something that you learned through perhaps co-treating with another discipline. Just think of something. And as we go through these techniques, sometimes people are pleasantly surprised to see that some of the things they're already doing actually has research behind it. And that's really great because then you have some references and resources to help show that evidence. So as an advanced organizer to what we are going to be doing with these 6 techniques and talking through them, this is the 6 techniques that we're going to be going through. So the first one is making sure we're using aided AAC models. This is really big, and again, one of those things that we kind of say, oh yeah, that's common sense, I should know to do that. But oftentimes people will skip this. And so we want to make sure that as we are teaching language and trying to really grow that expressive language, that we are using the device, that we are modeling with the system, whether that's a low-tech board that you have temporarily or a high-tech NovaChat or Chat Fusion that they just got. The second one is providing wait time. Now, if you are in the speech and language world, you may have heard this term referred to as expectant delay, which is basically us allowing plenty of time for our client or child to make sure that they have processed what we have said to them, and that we're giving them enough time then to formulate a response. Way too often we go way too fast, we rush things. If we are a graduate student, for example, sometimes we feel like there needs to be constant talking, something happening every bit of our session, especially if we're being watched, if we're being supervised, and that's really not the case. This waiting time or this expectant delay is such a huge component of really shifting that expectation from being a passive communicator to an active and initiating communicator. So we want our clients to understand that this time, this therapy, this learning is for them, and that we expect them to be participating. It's a back and forth, it's a conversation. The third one is asking WH questions. Now, a lot of times what we tend to do as clinicians is fall into one of two camps here, where it might be we're asking two option or two choice questions, such as, do you want this or this? Or we fall into asking yes, no questions, and then we stay there. So while this can be something that gets us started and gets our client used to using AAC and really becoming engaged with the technology, we don't want to stay in those types of questions. We want to make sure that we're asking open-ended, higher level language questions. But then becomes an issue if we're asking these questions and our partner is not answering them. We don't want to leave those questions just kind of hanging there awkwardly and then we move on, because that is going to actually encourage that passive role. So we ask a question, our client or our communication partner does not answer, and we move on. We either change topics or we keep on going. That is teaching them that it's fine if they don't answer. We're just going to keep right on going. And so they can basically kind of sit there and take a break and we're going to be okay with it. So we need to provide answers. We need to make sure it's clear that we're asking these WH questions. We want these answers. And if our client is not going to provide those answers, we are setting the expectation that, okay, we are going to answer the questions. And we're also providing language examples. Again, think about when we are working with young infants and toddlers. We ask questions rhetorically, even though we know, for example, a 9-month-old isn't going to answer us back speaking wise. They may, have some comprehension depending on the question and give us a clue as to what they might be understanding, but they're not going to answer back verbally. So we give those answers back. We might say something like, oh, where are we going today? Oh, we're going to go to Target today. We're not just leaving the questions unanswered. So we want to do the same thing when we're working with AAC. The fifth one is providing a prompt. Now, this can be a verbal or a physical prompt or a combination of the two. And in the beginning, we may need to provide these prompts quite frequently. We may need to provide both of them simultaneously because this is a new device. We're changing the expectations. Maybe our client has been quite happy in that passive communication role for some time. And now we are expecting them to become active and participate in these conversations. So we might need to give a prompt, and that's okay. And then number 6 is being more responsive. If a client takes a turn, if our communication partner uses their device, even if it's perhaps for something that is off topic or something that we think might not be an accurate selection, we still need to respond, because we would respond if they were speaking. We would stop and say, oh, what was that? Oh, we're not talking about the beach right now, but you mentioned something about the beach. What is it that you want to say about it? We wouldn't just ignore it. So we want to make sure that we're responding. So these are the 6 techniques that I've just highlighted that we're now going to go and spend a little bit more time talking about. And then again, I'm going to show you some videos so you can see what they look like, so that you can hopefully implement them a little bit faster and easier in your own practice with them. So things to keep in mind as we go through these. There are some very common traits of individuals of any age that use AAC systems, and this is from the research. So for example, we know, this is why we're getting them an AAC system in the first place, that they know more than they are actually saying. They have quite a bit of receptive language and cognition, but for whatever reason, their natural speech abilities don't allow them to produce that. So we know that they have quite a bit of knowledge, they're just not actually producing it. They can be passive communicators, as I've already mentioned. Again, over time, this role becomes perpetuated and even exaggerated because of the fact that we as communication partners tend to dominate the conversation, and we don't allow for a certain amount of time to produce longer utterances or complex utterances. And they communicate for a limited number of reasons. Again, that's typically because of how we as partners are asking certain questions and posing certain things. So if we're only asking yes/no questions or 2-choice questions, then that's what they get used to. And a single symbol utterance typically will suffice for either of those 2 questions, and we can leave it at that and move on. And so we are not allowing that language growth, which is why we then, as they get older, we continue to see restricted grammar and syntax. One of the things that as an SLP we are always thinking about is how to not only grow the language to multi-symbol messages and longer utterances, but how are we going to make those utterances morphologically and syntactically correct? How are we going to teach them how to change to irregulars and irregular plurals, for example? So we want to make sure that we are not really encouraging these common traits. So to make sure that we don't do that, let's turn the mirror on ourselves here. I encourage you, before you start to implement some of these techniques, take a moment to reflect, and even if you're able to record a therapy session or be a little bit metacognitive in your next conversations with your clients or your children, think about what it is that you're doing just naturally, because you might see, oh my goodness, I didn't think I was taking the majority of communication turns, but now that I'm thinking about what I'm doing, I see that I am. Because it is proven that we as communication partners tend to take the majority of the turn, and we do provide very few opportunities for linguistic growth. Again, we're not modeling that more advanced and complex grammar and syntax. We interrupt, and this is a really big one, especially if we're familiar with the client or the child that we're working with and life is busy and things are moving at a fast pace. We can interrupt if we feel like we know what they're trying to say, and that's not good. We try and teach people not to interrupt when other people are speaking. We need to do the same thing. And the last one is pretty typical of clinicians, and that's their focus being on the technology versus the person. One of the most common questions that I get asked in consultations by speech and language pathologists is, okay, so what kind of goals do I make? Because I've never used this device and I don't know what kind of goals to make. Well, your goals are still going to be on the language growth and the device use, the linguistic, the operational, the social, the strategic goals that Dr. Light talks about in her research. And so that hasn't changed just because they have a device now. The device is a tool allowing us to target their language goals and make them a productive, active member in their community and become a more active communicator. So focusing on the technology is really not where we want to be putting our energy and our main attention. It's still on the client or the person. So as we always want to, we want to make sure we take a look at some of the research. So all of these techniques have been validated across various partners, whether it's parents, educators of some type, it could be a teacher, it could be a paraprofessional, and even peers. Same-aged peers and peers in a classroom, if they have a buddy system, a lot of schools will pair, for example, an 8th grader with a 5th grader or so forth. We have used these techniques throughout research across all of these different groups, and is also through different demographic groups as well. I've given you a list of names down there at the bottom because quite a bit of research through these scholars has been done around communication partner techniques, and the majority of the research that we're looking at and this webinar and the one following next week is really on the work of Drs. Jennifer Kent Walsh and Kathy Binger. So I highly encourage you, if you aren't already following their research, please do so. They have done quite a bit in this arena, and in my opinion are the leading scholars in such an area. The research studies have also been done in various contexts. So if you are a school-based SLP and you're looking at this wondering, okay, can I use this in a group? Yes, we have done this in group studies, whether it's been in small intervention groups or even through something like a summer camp. And then we've also done them one-on-one. If you are more a private practice or outpatient type of clinician, we've got data for you in both scenarios. So one of the things that you'll see through the videos is I'm going to be using this board as a low-tech board to model for you. It shows up a little bit better in the videos than having a NovaChat, for example, and it stays static, so it's a little bit easier to follow along. You can access quite a few low-tech board options right on our website. So please feel free to go ahead and access those anytime you want to. It's very helpful for anyone. And if you're not familiar with our word power files within our chat devices, this is how they're organized, and it stays pretty consistent like this, whether you're on a 20-item display or a 108-item display. And it's loosely based off of the Fitzgerald key color coding system. So if you're familiar with that, you'll see that that looks pretty similar here as well. All right, so remember I said we're going to repeat some things. So our 6 techniques, we're going to use aided AAC models. We're going to provide that expectant delay or that wait time. We're going to make sure we're asking open-ended, higher level WH questions. And if they're not answered by our client, we are going to provide those answers and give them a model. We may need to provide a prompt, whether it's verbal or physical, and we're going to be responsive. We will respond to the turn, whether it is in complete context to what we have been talking about and what we asked, or if it's off topic or we think it might be an incorrect selection. So the first one, modeling. The whole point of this is to really demonstrate using the technology. Sometimes people that maybe are not as familiar with AAC as others kind of view getting a high-tech device like a NovaChat as like this, magic button. Now everything's going to get better just because we have this technology, and they're just going to naturally know how to use it. Now, some people are going to gravitate towards a device and really pick up on things naturally and learn where certain words are organized, and others are going to take a little bit of time. In my experience, a lot of times the children will pick up on the technology pretty quickly, and it's the adults that take a little bit more time on learning that. So the model allows not only you to show how to use the device, but also it allows you to learn at the same time. So we have to use the board or the device vocabulary as we are communicating. Now, what this doesn't mean is that you have to push a button for every single word that you're speaking. So the example that I always like to tell is about a grandmother that I was working with, and she was the primary caregiver during the day for her grandson. And they pretty much had chicken nuggets or macaroni and cheese every day for lunch. And so she would ask him this question every day: would you like macaroni and cheese or chicken nuggets? And during a visit with her one time, she said, I'm just struggling because I can't find every single word, even though it's a sentence that I say all the time. And it's slowing me down, and I'm getting frustrated, and he's getting frustrated, and so I just don't use it. And so I said, okay, first off, let's take a step back. Do you know where the button for macaroni and cheese is? And she said, yes, of course. And I said, what about chicken nuggets? And she said, yes, definitely. We use both of them. I said, great. So could you say the sentence, would you like macaroni and cheese or chicken nuggets for lunch? And instead of trying to push every single button, just push macaroni and cheese and chicken nuggets. It's on the same page. They're pretty close to each other on his page set. And that was very easy. So that she was able to then take the pressure off of her trying to feel like she had to know where every single word in that sentence was. And she could just model the macaroni and cheese or the chicken nuggets with ease. And she was providing that aided language modeling. She was showing him how to use it. And then he could then mimic back whether he pushed the item that he wanted, or he could answer yes, no to, push one or the other. So it's really important that we are modeling, but keep in mind, you do not have to model every single word that you're saying. On the flip side, you don't want to not speak. A lot of times people will think that, okay, I've gotten really good, I'm using the device, I can model every single word that I want to say for that utterance. But we need to still use our natural speech. We still need to give them that language model, that spoken language, paired with the aided modeling. So you may touch the button while you're saying the word or after you're saying the word. There's no right or wrong way. What is right or wrong is making sure that you're pairing both of them together. So I'm going to show you this in a video, and you can see here. Now, what this is doing, what this video is showing is actually, I have taken a book from Tar Heel Reader. If you're not familiar, that's a great resource. So this is actually a glossed version of this book. So what I've done is I've used our chat editor software in order to use some of the text that's on the book and put those symbols right below so that it makes it easier for me. If I was doing this activity in therapy, I don't even have to think about where those buttons are or what I'm going to be modeling. It's already laid out for me. So you'll see me reference the book on the video and then go over to the board.
Okay, so for our first video, I'm going to show you what modeling looks like. So I've got a sample book here. It's called Going on a Picnic, and it has been glossed, meaning that I have put different examples of symbols that you could use for each page, and each page has been combined onto this single sheet here for ease of this. And then over here to the other side, I've got our 96 location low-tech board that I'm going to use to model certain steps here for you. Now, this board is a little bit more complex than perhaps the device or the board that your child or student is using. But since I'm just modeling for you today, I wanted to use a more complex one. You can do this modeling feature with any board at all, whether it's 4 items or over 100, it doesn't matter. So let's pan back over here. And I want to show you what it looks like. Here I have Going on a Picnic, and it's got a visual, and I've got it glossed with go and eat. So when we're reading and we're modeling, we might say something like, today we're going to read about going on a picnic. And what I would model would say, go. And then I might ask a question, because over here, we're talking about a picnic. I might say, oh, we're going to go and we're going to eat on a picnic. So I am modeling not only what is written on the page, but also having some dialogue in there, and I'm modeling that dialogue. We pan back over. Our next page says, we will spend some time with good friends. And if I was modeling, I could even put we, or I could put time, as I've modeled on our book here, or I could say something like a comment like, that will make me very happy to spend time with friends on a picnic. The next page shows, we'll pack a lunch, and I have we and a. So we could model those, or I could come over here and I could model part of my dialogue. If I wanted to be simple with what I have on my board, I could come over here and say, we will pack a lunch. So I'm simply pointing to an item that is either on the text of the book that I'm reading, or I'm using a comment, I'm creating a dialogue, and I'm modeling whatever it is that I choose to say for that question or comment.
So hopefully that helps you see it in action for some of our visual learners there. Okay, technique number 2, pausing or expectant delay. So the point of this is to really allow for more communication opportunities. We want to make sure that our clients understand there's an expectation here for communication. We want them to be a participant in this conversation. It's not just one-sided. But it also allows for additional processing time. Again, depending on the age of the client and the diagnosis of the client, we may need to provide additional processing time no matter what. But all too often, what seems like a really long time, in actuality, might only be 3 or 4 seconds. And so you really want to make sure that we've given not only time to process, but then time to formulate a response. And then if they're using their technology and if it's brand new, they may have to then think about where certain words are located, and that can take a long time. So how do we do this? Number 1, I recommend that you practice this, because this, even for seasoned clinicians, if you're not used to doing this, it can feel very odd. But it is extremely effective. And the more you do it, the more you practice it, the easier it becomes. It just becomes a natural part of your therapy, whether you're using AAC or not. So what you want to do is, number 1, maintain eye contact. We want to make sure that, again, we are actually having an expectation. So we're maintaining eye contact. We might lean in, we might raise our eyebrows. Giving that nonverbal communication that it's your turn, I'm expecting you to say something. And so we want to make sure that as we give this pause time, that we really make sure it's a good amount of time. Now, there's no baseline, so to speak, of what's too long or not long enough. So what I try and guide people towards is count to 10 in your head. And if you can see that your partner is trying to formulate a response or is starting to go to their device, give them more time. If you have to give them 1 minute to 2 minutes, even if they are working on generating a response, that's great. Just because you got to 10 doesn't mean like, oh, time's up. It's not the kitchen timer here dinging at you telling you to move on. You can give them more time. However, if you get to 10 and you've given them a nice time to formulate and process, then you see that they're totally embracing that passive role and they're not doing anything in order to attempt to communicate back. That's when you could move on. We're not going to sit there for 45 seconds if it's pretty clear that our partner is not trying to communicate back with us. But that's why we call it expectant delay as well. So here it is in action.
So here we are, and I'm going to show you how to pause or demonstrate expectant delay. And this may seem something that sounds really easy and natural, and yet it hands down can be one of the hardest different techniques to master. So we're using our same book and our same 96 location page. And while we are reading, we can pause either after we read the text, we will spend some time with good friends, and of course, we model on our board. But instead of going right to the next one, to the next page, or turning the page or moving right along, we're going to pause. Now, people will say, how long do I pause? And that is going to vary by every single client. A really good baseline or starting point would be to count to 10 slowly in your head. So trying the old school, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, but looking at the child or the client and judging, are they processing what you've said and what you've read? Are they looking at the symbols on the book? Are they looking at the symbols on the page or the device and trying to think of a response or a comment? Because if they are, you want to give them more time. So this may be longer or shorter than 10 seconds. And typically, as you go, the pause time gets less and less as our clients move from a very passive communicator to an active communicator. So here's what it might look like. If I were to say something like, we will pack a lunch, and I come over and I comment, I love to have a picnic lunch. Instead of moving along and asking a question immediately or making a comment, I'm going to wait. That was 10 seconds. Now that may have seemed like a very long time. And you know what? When you're in the moment, it is. But it's really not that long when we're asking a client to really process what we've said and think about what we're showing them as far as on our page and in our book.
Okay, so moving on to technique 3, asking WH questions. Now, the reason, as I've already mentioned, is to really prompt that higher level communication. If we get stuck in asking yes/no questions, we are modeling some of the most simple, easy language possible. So we really want to provide those examples and models for higher level communication, and they're open-ended. The question itself is setting the expectation for a response that is typically longer and more advanced linguistically than a simple 2-choice or yes/no question. So we want to replace these yes/no questions with WH questions. So in the beginning, it might be really simple. Instead of saying, do you want mac and cheese? You might say, what do you want for lunch? Even if we know they want macaroni and cheese, we're going to ask it in a WH format. So this is something that, again, can take some reflection when you think about how do I typically ask questions and how can I change those questions to be in a WH format. They don't have to be super advanced, metacognitive type of questions. They just have to be WH questions. So you can start with something simple like that. And again, you want to model that asking both with your speech and with the NovaChat. So in the example, what you're going to see here is in our book, it says, what might we need to buy at the store to eat? And I've glossed it with the WH word, what, because that's going to be an important word in our vocabulary. And then I also put need and then eat. So again, I'm able to model these, not every single word in the sentence, but I am making sure that I'm including the model for my WH word and not just only asking it as well. So when we ask these questions, typically when we start doing this, our clients and our partners are not going to immediately respond. It might take a little while because, again, depending on how old they are and how long they've been using AAC, this might be kind of flipping the script for them where, oh, wait a minute, You're not just going to keep right on going. Every other interventionist or clinician that I've had for therapy, if they ask a question and I don't respond, they just move right along. Well, now we're changing that. So if they do not answer, then we're going to provide that answer. So it again gives that language model, and it teaches that question and answer format, that conversational style back and forth with, for example, some younger or newer AAC clients. So this does mean that you are answering your own question, and you might feel a little silly at first, and that's okay. Again, the research shows this is effective. So you don't want to go, well, I feel silly, I'm just going to skip the answering part. You really want to make sure that you include it. And again, you're using both your speech and the device. So for example, this is an answer. Fruit sounds good. And I could model it with the word good. So answering the question, what are we going to buy at the store to eat? So let's take a look at the video here.
So this technique I've mentioned in our other two videos about asking questions, but we really want to make sure that when we are asking questions, we are asking open-ended, meaningful questions that really require more of a response than a simple yes or no, that really require our client to think about it. And again, we want to move them from being a passive communicator to an active communicator. So asking these open-ended WH questions is a wonderful way to do that. Now, in your text, when you are looking at these samples here, you may notice that some of the items have a WH question already in the text, like this one. What might we need to buy at the store to eat? So we can model that very easily over here. We can provide that pausing and expectant delay, and we've asked our what question right off the bat. But what about when we are having a conversation or reading a book that does not have a WH question in the text? Something like this, fruit sounds good. That's just a comment, that's an observation. And while we can model that over here about being good, we really can follow up with a WH question like, what fruit should we get? Or where is the best place to get fruit? Or when can I get a grapefruit? Something like that, that really allows for more advanced, in-depth thinking, and again, just expands that language and allows for more conversation. It doesn't have to be included as text on a book, and it doesn't have to be the same WH questions every time. Now, if they don't answer your WH question, and you've given them plenty of time to pause and process, you can tell that that's not the case, you don't just want to leave that question unanswered. Go ahead and model that question's answer. So if we were to do this one, what might we need to buy at the store to eat? We could come over here and we could answer that question. Well, we would need to buy food. And so we may have to navigate into another page, or we could say something like, we will need to get something to eat, like oranges or grapefruit. If we are over here and we ask, or we read this page, fruit sounds good, and I ask a question, what kind of fruit should we get? And I don't get an answer. I might then answer that for my client and say, oh, I know what fruit I'm going to get. I love grapefruit. Let's get some of that. So you don't want to just leave that WH question that you've posed there open and hanging unanswered. Go ahead and model the way to answer that correctly. Give that complex language model, and then we can move on.
Okay, and so now let's talk about prompts. So we've got verbal and physical prompts. And again, the point of providing either of these is to really make sure that we give some type of indication that we expect a response. We expect a response maybe on the device. As they become able to produce more complex and longer utterances, we might remind them that we expect 2 or 3 symbols in their response, whatever it is that the expectation is. We want to give that indication. Again, in the beginning, when you first start working with someone with a device, or a client gets their device, you may have to give these more frequently. We talk about scaffolding in the therapy world, about how oftentimes we have to provide more support when we introduce something new or someone starts intervention, and as they go, that scaffolding comes down. We remove layers of that support. And so instead of providing a verbal prompt every time, maybe now you're providing it every 3 times and then every 10 times, things like that. If you have to pair it with a physical prompt, maybe eventually you remove that physical and you only have the verbal. But we want to give them a direct indication about our expectation. Now, you want to make sure you keep your prompts short and clear. A lot of times we get, again, as communication partners, we cause more problems sometimes than we are actually solving. And when we're trying to give prompts, we end up having this, lengthy string of prompts where it might be something like, okay, it's your turn. You got to use the device. No, right here. Use your device right here. Show me the picture. Come on, you can do it. What are you going to tell me? And we, number one, don't give any pausing in between them, but we are bombarding their system with language. So we want to keep it brief and clear and also specific. Use your Nova chat to tell me. Show me 2 symbols. Do you have something you want to say? Something like that, that is clear and simple, and we leave it, and then we go back to that expectant delay as well. We want to make sure we keep ourselves in check, that we're not having a lack of expectant delay after we've provided that verbal prompt. Now, let's say that a verbal prompt isn't enough or isn't working. We can go to a physical prompt, and every environment, every setting has different philosophies and sometimes rules on physical prompts. So make sure you visit those if you're providing these physical prompts in a workplace. But basically, you're giving a physical reminder. Again, you can pair it with a verbal reminder as to what we expect the client to do. So it might be something like hand under hand. It might be a tap on the shoulder, a tap on the elbow. It can even be something like a gesture where you are pointing towards the Nova chat, or maybe waving your arm towards their screen, something like that. And again, as little of a physical prompt as you are able to find success with is what we want to do. If tapping someone on the elbow is working just as well as hand under hand, then let's go with that one, okay? If waving towards the device is better than tapping on the elbow, then we're going to want to go with the wave or the gesture. So again, we want to remove these as quickly as possible because we want that independence. But physical prompts are not necessarily a bad thing. I know sometimes they can get a bad rap or have a reputation, but truly, and this is supported by research, they can be very helpful when we are working with increasing communication in an aided AAC situation. So let's take a look at these paired together.
Okay, so we are on step number 5 for our 5th technique. And now what we want to do is provide a verbal prompt. So we have shown that modeling, we've given a pause or expectant delay, we've asked and answered some WH questions, and sometimes we still need to provide some type of prompt. So a verbal or a physical prompt is totally okay to provide that if we need to. You may find that you need to do this a little bit more in the beginning just because, again, we're moving from that passive to active communicator status. So we've been modeling with this book, and maybe you're down here, fruit sounds good, and you've asked a question and you've answered it, and you can tell that they're thinking, and so you can say, you show me, or show me on your Nova chat, or point to one, or it's your turn, show me two. Those types of verbal prompts are sometimes very necessary. Sometimes, for whatever reason, people may feel like they need permission to use their own device. Perhaps it's new, perhaps they're in a new environment, and unfortunately, sometimes perhaps people have even used a device as a reinforcement and taken it away and then brought it back. And so they feel like they need permission. That's okay. Give them a verbal prompt to show. And then I also just demonstrated a physical prompt. So showing them on here where it is and what you can push, or a physical prompt of touching their hand, tapping them on the top of the hand, moving their hand over, or touching their elbow or their shoulder. Those types of physical prompts are okay. We don't want to have total hand over hand where you are guiding their hand, but hand under hand can work. Or again, if you in the very beginning are modeling something very basic, that's when you would go hand over hand. But for this type of physical prompt, it's more of a reminder to use the device, use their low-tech system, whichever it is that they're using, to answer the question and participate in the conversation.
Okay, and that brings us to our last technique, increased responsivity, which, as I've mentioned, is really our priority to make sure that we are reinforcing those communication attempts. So let's say, for example, we are reading a book about going to the grocery store, like we've seen in our videos, and our client makes a selection on their Nova chat that says something about the beach. What oftentimes we may be finding ourselves doing up to this point is saying, nope, we're not talking about the beach right now. Let's go back. We're talking about the grocery store. We're talking about the food that we're going to get. We want to respond to that instead of basically overriding and making a determination that whatever it was that they were trying to say isn't important. So we might respond with something like, oh, do you go to the grocery store before you go to the beach? Or something even more generic like, oh, did you want to talk about the beach? Okay, let's talk about it. And then if it was an incorrect selection, you'll know pretty quickly, but let them be the ones to tell you that, to communicate that. We don't want to override and, again, kind of rule the conversation. Now, that said, we do also have to keep in mind, sometimes there may be a delay or an avoidance tactic with therapy, and that doesn't apply here. Sometimes people will message me and say, hey, I'm trying to be responsive, but I feel like they're using it as a way to get out of a therapy task. Well, if that's what's happening, then no, we can steer things back to what we need it to be, focused on our goals and our therapy process. But if it is a genuine communication attempt, we want to make sure that we are responding to that. It also allows us to be able to expand some of the utterances that may be produced. Again, we're always wanting to make sure that we're providing complex language models, and so by increasing our responsivity, it allows us to do that. So the way that we do that is we are consistent in responding to the content of their messages, whether it's within the conversational topic that we're already on or outside of it. It could even be something where they give us a direction, as you'll see in the next video, and we respond to that verbally and in our actions. So take a look at this one.
All right. So, okay, when I'm feeling hungry, it's best to keep clear. That's for sure, because he's eating the deer, right? Can you tell me eat? Look at that, he's squeezing him so he can eat him. Eat is right here, but go. What would you like for me to do?
So you can see she not only modeled that expected delay for us, but she was responsive. Okay, I'll go. I'll turn the page. So hopefully, as we wind down our hour together, you have these 6 techniques committed to memory so that you're not going to have to reference back to your notes in order to implement them. So we are committed to using AAC models, using our NovaChat, our device, to make sure that we are providing not only spoken language models, but aided AAC models. We are committed to providing that wait time or that expectant delay. Remember, we're going to count to 10 in our head, give plenty of time. And if we see that there is a likelihood that a message is being formulated, then we're going to give more time to allow for that. And we're also going to provide that nonverbal feedback of expectation. So we're going to lean forward, we're going to raise our eyebrows, and we're going to maintain eye contact so that it's, again, that expectation of, I said something, now it's your turn. We're going to ask WH questions. Make sure that we are asking questions that are going to promote that higher level language processing and production. If we have to practice this beforehand, we're committed to doing that to make sure that we don't fall back into those simple yes, no, or 2-choice questions when we're in the moment. And again, we're going to remember that if we ask those WH questions and our client doesn't respond, that we're going to answer them. We're going to provide that language model, and we might feel silly at first, but we know that it's going to give us good results in the end. We're committed to providing verbal and physical prompts, whether we need both of them when we start, or we can move and just start with one. And again, we want to fade those as quickly as we are able to. Now, as you start to increase language complexity and you add layers to your therapy, you may see these come and go. They may phase in and phase out. That's totally normal. And number 6, we're going to respond. We are not driving the bus on this communication and conversation anymore alone. We are making sure that we have this back and forth give and take. And even if they have something that we think is an inaccurate selection, we're going to respond and make sure that they understand that, again, we're partners in this conversation here. So as I mentioned in the beginning of our webinar, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. So next Tuesday, I'll be doing part 2. So if you haven't already registered, please go ahead and do that. I'd love to see you back on there, because what we do next week is we take these techniques and we start to then put them into 2 types of strategies that are very similar, the raw and the wrap strategies, which are based off of the early work of Dr. Jennifer Kent Walsh, one of the researchers that I mentioned earlier in this, who's a great resource to follow her publications for communication partner instruction. So the next week is really focused on those, but taking what we learned today and moving our clients to the next level so that they can be more strategic in not only how we provide intervention, but how they are then able to take this knowledge and become better communicators. Again, thinking long term about where we're headed, what goals do we have for independence, for perhaps employment or secondary education, things like that. So I'd like to thank you for spending this time with me. If you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box and I'll answer them verbally once I see them pop up. And if you have a question but you don't have time to type it in there right now, please email me. I'm happy to communicate and answer any questions back and forth, even if we have to get on the phone or something like that. I want to make sure that I answer anything that you guys may have that perhaps was unclear. Please note that we have numerous resources available to you on our website, saltillo.com. There are manuals and quick reference guides on there. We also have links to past webinars and video tutorials if you are needing something, even something as a demonstration tool for a NovaChat. You can find those there. We also have implementation materials, and you can find us on social media as well. There are different groups on Facebook and videos on YouTube and things like that. I see we have some questions coming into the chat box here. Yes, all the webinars are recorded. And a question that someone posed was, how do you address a child that can answer vocally on familiar questions? So do you still use the AAC device? So that's a great question. If a child is able to answer something verbally, then you're not necessarily going to use that AAC device 100% of the time. But what I would encourage you to do then is look at how they are answering. Are they answering with a simple yes, no? That's a reliable verbal response. And then can you use the AAC device to expand that, to provide a longer and more complex sentence? Can you use the device to model that longer, more complex sentence? Because chances are what they do have as a reliable verbal response or output is going to be simple and probably not very grammatically or syntactically complex. So to grow language, we can absolutely use the AAC device to kind of piggyback off of that, reliable verbal response. That was a great question. Thank you for asking. Here's some other resources and support items for you. You can find my email right there, melissa.m@saltillo.com. And of course, we've got resources online and our tech support and our new funding website, which is aacfunding.com. Please check that out if you have not already. And I hope to see you guys next week. I won't keep you any longer than I promised, but thank you for spending the last hour with me, and have a great day.